Anche su questo seminario seguendo l'inglese abbiamo appena fatto una battuta su un francese che parlerà in inglese di cose italiane. Questo è il primo seminario, si diceva con Enzo, che è aperto al pubblico nella nuova sede del THP, il Palazzo del Regno. Questo è anche il piano dove i fellows dei progetti del Turin Humanities Programme hanno i loro spazi di lavoro e siamo molto contenti di utilizzare questa sala bellissima. Oggi abbiamo il grande piacere di ospitare Benoît Grévin, che è un direttore di recherche del Centre de recherche scientifique francese, il suo laboratorio è a Parigi, ma è anche membro del Centre de recherche scientifique dell'École de l'Éducation sociale. È un medievista che si è occupato moltissimo di questioni di comunicazione, lingua e contatti culturali nel mondo soprattutto tardo medievale. Ed è anche un linguista straordinario che può lavorare non soltanto in latino nei vari volgari medievali italiani e francesi, ma anche in arabo, e ha anche prodotto dei testi dei romanzi della giapponese. Vedrà molto interessato non soltanto all'histoire française, ai punti di contatto tra civiltà diverse, soprattutto nel Mediterraneo, ma anche a problemi di storia comparata. Siamo stati insieme a un seminario a Nara nel ottobre 2017, organizzato da Benoît, in cui storici dell'Europa e storici dell'Università si confrontavano su varie questioni. Vi do una lista breve delle sue opere più importanti e poi vi lascio la parola. La sua tesi di dottorato è stata pubblicata dal Fondazione di Roma e si occupava delle lettere di Pier della Vigna, il grande segretario di Federico II, nella storia della retorica dell'ars dictaminis. E poi in seguito, oltre a moltissimi lavori di edizioni e di traduzioni, Benoît ha pubblicato per Seuil Le Parchemin des Cieux, essai sur le Moyen Âge du langage nel 2012, poi per l'École des Chartes, le pubblicazioni dell'École des Chartes nel 2014 con Sébastien Barret, Regalis Excellentia, sui preamboli degli atti dei re di Francia nel XIV secolo. E più recentemente, al di là delle fonti classiche, le epistole dantesche e la prassi duecentesca dell'Ars Dictaminis per le edizioni di Ca' Foscari. E infine, proprio 2 anni fa, nel 2021, la première loi du royaume, l'acte de fixation de la majorité des rois de France per Garnier. E in questo momento, tra le varie cose che sta facendo, si sta occupando insieme ad altri studiosi anche italiani dell'edizione di un favoloso Corano giudeo-islamico, un manoscritto prodotto in Sicilia alla fine del Medioevo, nel 400, che lo sta appassionando molto. Benoît conosce molto bene uno dei membri della nostra equipe, Evgenia Scelina, e abbiamo pensato di invitarlo perché il nostro progetto si occupa della metafora corporea e ci siamo domandati se l'idea stessa di metafora non avesse bisogno di una contestualizzazione storica. E quindi abbiamo pensato a lui perché ci dicesse qualche cosa delle nozioni e delle idee del XII-XIII secolo che i maestri di retorica, di grammatica avevano della metafora. Ecco qui, dunque il titolo del paper di oggi è From Body to Universe, a lesson in metaphor con Boncompagno da Signa, e ti lascio la parola.
Allora, sarà in inglese, come avete ormai capito, però 2 parole in italiano che, come capirete adesso, per quelli che conoscessero meno, è un po' strano per me parlare a Torino in inglese, lo farei più facilmente in italiano. Ci ho detto, abbiamo pensato alla struttura del programma e effettivamente ci sono nella sala probabilmente 3 persone o 4 persone che sono più a disagio in italiano rispetto all'inglese, e questo vuol dire che valeva la pena prendere l'inglese come denominatore comune, come si direbbe in matematica e penso anche in italiano. Non impedisce naturalmente che se ci sono delle questioni o delle critiche, tutto quello che volete, o delle precisazioni, le potete fare in italiano, ma sarà anche più facile per me, per la parte direttamente italofona, o in inglese per quelli che preferiscono il francese, per quello che fosse ancora tardato nel XX secolo a Torino, dove fu lingua di comunicazione anche, credo, di sapere. E prima di passare all'inglese, ancora due parole per ringraziare sia la Fondazione, qui contemplo già un po' i misteri, con il privilegio di aver lavorato un po' in questo palazzo straordinario, l'efficienza e la gentilezza degli organizzatori del progetto, dell'amministrazione. Un grande ringraziamento sia a Serena sia a Evelina, che effettivamente l'hanno tutte portato qui. E per non perdere tempo, perché abbiamo un discorso un po' lungo, dunque passo al mio inglese con l'accento un po' francese e al nostro soggetto. Metaphorical thinking permeates traditional cultures. It is constitutive of the reading of sacred texts and their interpretation, of the linguistic, stylistic and rhetorical training of their literate, which involves the study and recollection of poetic or highly poetized texts, and of the rhetoric of the traditional powers. Writing a long-term history of metaphorical thought is, however, very difficult if one takes into account the effects of sedimentation and accumulation of textual strata and references characteristic of traditional cultures. The stability of certain referential corpuses, such as the religious texts of Islam and Christianity, the importance of the poetic or non-poetic classics of the Greco-Latin, Muslim, or Confucian traditions, combined with the desire for rhetorical continuity on the part of powers interested in spreading themselves in an order that is dreamed of as immutable. All of this ensure the overall durability of metaphorical frameworks until the height of the modern era, and often until the threshold of the 20th century, while not preventing their complexification and evolution in detail over time. To study this evolution is an eminently complex task. Having been an advocate of comparatism in textual history for a long time, having attempted to explore in an essay published 11 years ago certain possible avenues of comparison between the textual cultures of medieval Islam and Europe, and having finally made more modest comparative forays into the field of Confucian studies, I can therefore only be personally enthusiastic about the contours of the program Political Thought and the Body, Europe and East Asia, which takes up this question of the comparatism of political languages in the long term with a solid methodology and competent actors. Today, at the invitation of two dear friends, Serena and Serena Ferente, I will not, however, address this question of comparatism, but I will speak from the precise and, after all, classic angle of the history of Western Latin rhetoric. To compensate for this lack of originality, I have chosen, in agreement with them, to raise the question of the thought of metaphor and its relationship with the body and political space in 12th and 13th century Europe from the work of an author who has a certain celebrity among specialists in medieval rhetoric, but whose writings remain largely underexploited because he does not fit into the canons of the great narrative of Western rhetoric, crushed between the classical and Renaissance poets. Boncompagno da Signa, professor of rhetoric and ars dictalis in Bologna and elsewhere in Italy between the late 12th and early 13th century. For this conference, I could have approached the theme of this program in a more frontal manner, starting from a study that perhaps responds more directly to its specification. In 2014, Serena said it, I published jointly with Sébastien Barret a large volume, somewhat pompously named Regalis Excellentia, les préambules des actes des rois de France au XIVe siècle, a study edition of set of 548 French real acts with a large rhetorical component. We have provided this presentation and editing work with a repertory of terms coupled with a cross-repertory of lexical fields, which delimits, among other things, an area of research concerning the body metaphor in the rhetoric of the French monarchy of the last great Capetians and the first Valois kings. Under the heading body, a set of 26 terms, and I made a sad discovery: ear, arm, head, flesh, heart, body, gesture, lip, tongue, hand, limb, eye, comb, chest, diaphragm, blood, breast, belly, and so on, sketches out the contours of a corporalized representation of the communication between the royal person and his kingdom. This means that I fully subscribe to the idea, developed in the introduction to the project, to your project, that it is the study of the texts of administrative practice and real political communication as much and more than that of theory, perhaps, that allows us to write a history of this metaphorized representation of the exercise of power and of its social links. By confronting the question of metaphor and its links with the body, with political language from the work of a great medieval rhetorical master, I am therefore taking a measured risk, that of making us return from the realm of concrete political language to a more ethereal and therefore more abstract theoretical sphere. We shall see, however, that the nature of the many texts written by Boncompagno, involving both theoretical reflections and the creation of pragmatic models, makes it possible to circumvent this pitfall. His work reflects two facets of medieval rhetoric, as it was taught in Bologna: theoretical reflection and modeling on the one hand, and the creation of model texts intended to prepare future notaries for their profession as writers of lectures, statutes, wills, and other texts with a more or less strong rhetorical content on the other. Although Boncompagno is not necessarily well known to specialists in classical or neoclassical rhetoric, he is a star of medieval rhetorical thought. His treatises are extraordinarily inventive, and in one of them, the Rhetorica Vissima, he left a chapter on metaphor, transuncio, of confounding originality, the implications of which extend far beyond the field of simple rhetoric to touch on various aspects of semantics. He is also an extraordinary storyteller, a whimsical personality, known for his mood swings and facetiousness, who speaks in his treatises as much about the signing weight of monks and deaf mutes as he does about the funeral costumes of the various people of the Mediterranean, or about the metaphorical aspect of medieval coats of arms or Roman monuments. To talk about metaphor, he uses everything from Adamic sin to homosexual mating, from alchemy to the mechanism of drinks. His work should be much more famous than it is. Symptomatically, it remains stuck in a linguistic and disciplinary no man's land that has prevented it from being more popularized. If he had written in Tuscan and not in Latin, which was impossible at the time his treatises were written, he would have been one of the most famous authors of the Italian Middle Ages. If he had written in humanistic Latin, which was also impossible around 500, he would still be more widely read. Finally, the fact that most of his writings, with the exception of the history of the siege of Ancona in 1173, are rhetorical treatises combining theory and examples, places him in a kind of intertextual no man's land, typical of pedagogical texts, which embarrasses specialists of literature as much as historians. His work is rich in rhetorical descriptions on the Mediterranean and European society and politics of the year 1180, 1112, and 230, with, for example, numerous digressions on the First Crusade, on Venice, on the Empire, on the situation of Italy. But they are always rhetorical models, fictions invented for the needs of his demonstrations. This work therefore hovers in an in-between that is still very dichotomous approach to sources. A still very dichotomous approach to sources, literary or non-literary, prevents from being characterized. For us, this in-between is an opportunity. We can explore how Boncompagno views metaphor from a theoretical point of view, and how the lectures and other fictional texts he creates, imitating the rhetoric of medieval powers, reflect or not these theoretical aspects. The temptation for me was to give in to the easy way and to talk to you for 3/4 of an hour about Boncompagno's rhetorical thought, leaving aside its relation with the body metaphor and its application to politics. I prefer to play the game and try to build a bridge that would link this presentation to the program by rereading Boncompagno's work in the light of your problems. I could only sketch this work because Boncompagno's work is vast and the keywords of the body metaphor form a non-negligible semantic field. It is therefore the results of a preliminary investigation, still very schematic, that I am presenting here in a French-style plan in 3 parts. There is a handout for those arrived later. First, we will quickly examine the characteristics of Boncompagno's metaphorical thought based on the 9th chapter of the Retorica Novissima on transunctiones or metaphors in the broad sense of the term. We will then examine different passages of Boncompagno's work dealing with the body in its directly metaphorical but also non-metaphorical aspects. Finally, we will try to understand in a 3rd step how the body metaphor is structured in the model lectures of political rhetoric created by Boncompagno in order to see what his rhetorical constructions tell us about the corporality of political metaphor in Italy in the years 1190-1230. So, Boncompagno. Boncompagno, born in Signa, near Florence, around 1165-70, died in Florence shortly after 1240, was not a sedentary scholar. He taught mainly, but not only in Bologna, but traveled all over northeastern Italy and even to Constantinople in his youth. He left a very considerable amount of treatises distinguished by a desire to unify the teaching of notarial rhetoric at a time when it was beginning to be divided between a national ars notariae aimed at the drafting of contracts or wills and a more mature ars dictaminis, teaching how to write letters and various solemn tracts. The treatises of this eccentric writer are distinguished by their particular position in the field of rhetorical teaching, that generally concentrated only on the letters. The Cedrus discusses communal statutes. The Mirra discusses wills. The Rota Veneris is a reflection on love letters. The great treatise Boncompagno's is a series of examples of letters on various subjects interspersed with linguistic and anthropological reflections. The second opus magnum, the Retorica Novissima, completed in 1235, is presented as a manual of eloquence going beyond the field of ars dictaminis and addressed in general to legal practitioners. Other treatises, such as the Liber de Amicizia, the nature of friendship, or the Liber de Malus Nectutis et Seni, on the evils of old age, take a social or moral question as their theme to offer a series of rhetorical variations. This variety, linked both to the proclaimed desire to supplant Ciceronian authority and to attract students, can also be explained by a totalizing vision of rhetoric, understood as the supreme doctrine that reflects and makes explicit the functioning of the machina mundi, and in particular of human society, a very conscious assertion which will be reflected in other masters or practitioners of Italian Latin rhetoric of the 13th century. The presentation of the metaphor, grouped under the superfigure of the transunctio, is nonetheless profoundly original compared to the equivalent passages in other rhetorical treatises. The concept of transunctio that Boncompagno uses for his reflection on metaphorical figures is not his own. This figure originates from Quintilian, where it is used in the sense of metalepsis, that is to say, a type of metonymy where the effect is said for the cause. We mourn him to say he is dead. This figure was adapted in France in the 12th century by theologians who analyzed the implications of the metaphorical apprehension of God, and it began to be used frequently in the last quarter of the 12th century to qualify metaphor in the broad sense, understood as the entire set of mechanisms of displacement of meaning between one term and another. The passage from theological thought to the rhetoric of ars dictaminis, that is, the art of ornate writing, especially applied to letters, in full development, a medialization of classical rhetoric, adapted to the communicative frameworks of feudal or communal society, was done in France through the intermediary of the arts of poetry or artes poetiae. The thought of the Transuncio invades the classes of eating and rhetoric precisely during the youth of Boncompagno. This theological origin of the medieval inflection in the rhetorical thought of metaphor is crucial. It allows us to understand on which level the literative relied to claim the preeminence of their rhetorical knowledge. The 12th and early 13th centuries were precisely the time when biblical exegesis, but also ars predicandi, the art of preaching, underwent a radical transformation, with the birth of sermo modernus and the development of the classical doctrine of biblical levels of meaning. The control of the metaphorical thought is explicitly linked in this framework to the interpretation of the biblical figurative language, more greatly classical, reread in a medieval perspective with its rich animal, vegetal, corporal, mineral symbolism. The Transuncio becomes thus the key of a universe having to be deciphered, initially starting from a biblical reading of the word. The political language, imitated from the recipes of the papal chancery, tends to be copied on a biblical phraseology aiming, as opposed to rhetoric of the clarity, to reconstitute a network of metaphorical meanings, thickening the political message. It is not a question of speaking clearly, but first of all of constructing tools of communication which reflect in an artificial language, consciously artificial language, the complexity of the biblical message. In detail, things are more complex because there existed tensions between these communicative choices of the cities of the north of Italy in which Boncompagno was evolving and those of the papal and Sicilian chanceries that were then elaborating a phraseology of the majestic power in the light of these surprising conceptions. These tensions have had an influence on the thought of Boncompagno. But the subject does not interest us today. The important thing is to understand that Boncompagno took advantage of this capture of heritage which allowed him to proclaim that the rhetorician, because he knows the secret of metaphor, possesses the key to the functioning of the universe. Handling at will the negative and positive symbols revealing the natural order of things, he can influence the listeners and direct the politics. The proud conception of the power of rhetoric based on the ability to handle metaphor explains the triumphant tone of chapter 9 of the Rhetorica Novissima on the Transuncio and the modalities of its presentation. You can follow on the handout also, and it's important that you do also. The rhetorical ornaments adorn the writings as the beauties of nature adorn the universe, as those of art adorn the objects crafted by man. The Transuncio is the mother of all ornaments, which runs unceasingly through the circle of the genres of the discourse. It is an imago of the discourse in which something is posed for another, but also a natural view under which are proclaimed the secrets of the things. The Transuncio applies to all the elements of the cosmos, of the machina mundi, not without a provable impulse of the nature, since the books of the prophets, like the Apocalypse, are filled with it. The soul of the sleeper of transience, that is to say, metaphorizes permanently in his sleeper. The Transuncio was invented in paradise, since God formed man in his own image, and he enunciated the first metaphor, forbidding Adam to eat of the wood of paradise, not of the tree. Boncompagno adds, as the first sexual allusion in this part of the treatise, that the meaning of this metaphor is debated. Was the tree an apple tree? Was the tree a fig tree? Or does it symbolize sexual intercourse? Boncompagno then reviews the different types of metaphor, from like to like, as when one qualifies a man by the name of an other man, Frederick II or David, from like to like, as when one qualifies a man or a group of men by an animal, the acacia by the dog. There are obscure and clear metaphors, courteous metaphors, and stupid ones. The presentation of courtly metaphors introduces an anthropological reflection à la Norbert Elias on the development of a culture of body metaphors aimed at concealing natural needs and intimate parts. It explains how the ass For example, pardon my French, is called the circle of modesty, or doctors alluring the superfluity of the first digestion, or they metaphorize the vulva as a door, the right limb as a road, the sperm as semen, the bone as a workshop for conception, and so on. The examples of metaphoric accidents also show how bodily characteristics are applied to people to give them a nickname, pussy nose, in a man with a particular nose, nasogata. A long sequence of metaphors that can be developed in two opposite directions lead to a palynotic description of the female body, whose limbs are first described in detail in language that exalts them, before being depicted in a depreciatory manner. The female sex, the member to be ashamed of, membrum pudicundum, is positively metaphorized as a gateway to paradise, a golden ring, a pharmacy of desirable spices. It is in the opposite sense metaphorized as a temple, built on a sewer, a rosa fetida, a door of confusion, a mouth of hell, a stream of stinking water, a cave of mourning, a furnace of burning fire, a shade, a vagina, a well, a shit pit. The woman herself becomes a member of the devil, the head of sin, the exclusion from paradise. After this litany, Boncompagno continues with a metaphorical presentation of the different forms of homosexual copulation, from masturbation to sodomy. Then, with two metaphors of copulation between a man and a man. Further on, he presents a series of metaphors on puberty, involving a play on horns, but also on squash-like vegetables. After this long corporal sequence revolving around sexuality, Boncompagno masterfully widens the scope of transcension. He insists indeed on the teleological implication of the transensual, which goes far beyond the simple linguistic metaphor. Alchemy, which symbolizes metals, metaphorizes permanently, it says he. On the other hand, the art of the jugglers, I guess the practitioners of courtly poetry in Occitan or Italian, is a permanent metaphor. Above all, the painted images and sculptures of celestial, earthly, monstrous, true, plausible, fabulous things, of fights, victories, miracles are all metaphors, transcensions. Some have become incomprehensible to us because they have been obscured over time, like the symbols sculpted by the Romans on their triumphal arches. Others are perfectly legible, like the symbols and stories related to the Bible, decorating cathedrals and churches. Noble families metaphorize their names on seats, buildings, banners. Finally, the sign language used by the shipwrecked, or the mutes, or the Sikhs, or the monks are also metaphors. Metaphor thus invades the world at all levels, by taking into account all figurative languages, whether they are linguistic at different levels, spoken or gestural, Latin or modern, or non-linguistic but figurative, or whether they are directly produced in the form of narrative cycles by being conscious in the sleep of man. Boncompagno closes this presentation by ironically pointing out that one must metaphorize in moderation, and by drawing up a metaphorical representation of the medieval arts and professions in the form of wills. This is the visio Boncompagno. Naturally, rhetoric holds a major place in it. Rhetoric containing in it life and death, possessing the capitals of nature, fixed to its wills, and controlling their movement. Rhetoric is still incomplete because of the lack of competent craftsmen, but Boncompagno arrives. So, second part. In this breathtaking presentation, unique in the 13th century, one could find such an extensive semiotic reflection in theological treatises, but hardly in rhetorical treatises. There is nevertheless one aspect missing. Boncompagno does not really speak of the corporeal metaphor of the body politic, at least in the first degree, even if an intensive examination of the metaphors presented allows us to move in this direction sometimes. The presentation of the will of civil law in the Visio Boncompagno thus shows lawyers, called knights, because their tongues were so many sharp swords with which they cut the misdeeds of those who exceeded by their bad words beyond the accepted social norm. The legal practitioners of the Northern Italian communal world are thus described as members of the social body whose language, producing the normative discourse, is metaphorized as so many swords, making them so many legal knights, tongues being swords. We will see that other parts of Boncompagno's work deliver in a form that is often much more conventional because it is imitated from the political rhetoric of his time, body metaphors of society. Let us take up for the moment in this second section the question of Boncompagno's treatment of body metaphor and of the body in general, considering some of its implications. I would like to begin this section by pointing out, through two examples already mentioned, that the boundary between the body metaphor apparently applied to the individual and the body metaphor applied to society, or the play with the body, the metaphor applied to the society with the metaphor of the body politic, making, for example, in the monarchical model of the sovereign, the head and of the subjects as many elements constituting the members of the social body, holds the attention by its plenitude, but it is impossible to inscribe other metaphorizations playing with the human body in a politicized reflection on the metaphor. Take the transfunction, again, the sodomites, in the Rhetorica Novissima. Aiming at the comic effect, certainly, it is of a rare complexity for us, even if it remains probably most comprehensible for a good scholar of the 13th century. The Gomorea declines up and down when he syllogizes according to the first figure. He is busy polishing the spare when he syllogizes according to the second figure. Or the Gomorea makes a cluster from the lower circle and puts the milks in the cloaca. Or he makes a long gloss on the low cumbir nubit in fenam. Or he shakes the branch of the tree so that the dew goes down from it. Or he writes a mule so that December covers the field with snow. The playfulness of the metaphor does not detract from its anthropological interest. The corporeal metaphor of the different forms of homosexual coitus passes through different techniques, all characteristic of Boncompagno's thought. The literary metaphor is obviously present, the juridical one also, with the comparison between compilation and declination, and of the gloss on the law of the Justinian Code that deals precisely with the repression of homosexuality. But there is also a medical metaphor, using the anus as a blister, vegetal metaphors, the dew of the tree, animal metaphors, riding the mule, and a whole range of metaphors concerning sperms and the mouth and the male sex. What is most important to note here is the importance of this construction for grasping the ongoing inflection strong at the beginning of the 13th century with the action of the nascent mendicant orders and the new canonical legislation in the management of homosexual practices. The long metaphoric sequence intertwining the title of a law that is a reminder of the foundation of the repression of homosexuality in the civil law with the folkloric elements of stigmatization of homosexuality as a sterile occupation, the mule, the month of December, merges literally the description of the sexual relation and its repressive framing under the double aspect of the derision and the sanction. In other words, the sinful body is metaphorized using the very tools of its repressions. The same can be said of the panody of the female body, which only appears anecdotal or literary if it is disconnected from its intertextual network and other communicative practices of this time. If the elements of glorification of the female body borrow partly from the biblical metaphorical repertoire, the Song of the Songs, the depreciative metaphors, which make in particular of the female sex a temple resting on a sewer, the cloaca, and of the woman a member of the devil, of her ornaments, the armor of the devil, concern the whole social body. The description of the female sex or of the woman as a temple built on a sewer, attributed by Simone de Beauvoir to Tertullian, seems in fact to have its origin in the Belugis Philosophorum of Pseudo-Cecilius Ballus. The important thing is that, like the qualification of the feminine ornaments as the armor of the devil, it permeates the society. The woman, Membrum Diaboli, learns the vast group of heretics, excommunicates and other impure members, Membra Diaboli, potentially excluded from the ecclesia. This could be carried in various forms by sermons and theological criticism until the modern era. The study of the intertextuality of the Membrum Diaboli and similar syntax allows us to place these apparently broad texts in their place in a progressive construction or adaptation of the political control of sexuality studied very recently by Giuliano Milani for the Florence of the time of the young Dante 2 generations later. If we go from the more theoretical atmosphere of the Retorica Novissima to the more pragmatic considerations of the treatise Boncompagno or the Liber de Amicizia, rich in model texts, it is not difficult to find examples where it is the whole social body that threatens to be bodily deformed by a socially reprehensible, legally problematic, and morally sinful behavior. This is the case with usury. The usurer is metaphorized as a worm and a camper, a cancer, a trap by the Retorica Novissima, while usury itself becomes in the Boncompagno a leprosy that deforms the limbs in an inexorable progression. I do not believe, however, that the examples of homosexuality, female perversity, and usury are separable. The metaphorical construction of wrongdoing through metaphors involving the body is in all three cases part of the same strategy of communicative framing of society. Before returning to the metaphorization of the body politic, let us now briefly visit various places in Boncompagno's work that evoke the human body. It is indeed important to point out that the reflection on the body that runs through this work has a deeper value than that of a simple rhetorical routine. To begin with, his attention to the body, very clear in Boncompagno's works, is directly linked to the art of rhetoric. In the final chapter of the Retorica Novissima, a description of the speaker in action shows that he plays with all the resources of his various limbs, stamping of the feet, play of the hands, facial expression, to persuade the crowd, just as in the chapters on the metaphors, the language of signs can replace the spoken and written language. In the oratorical actions itself, the bodily speech doubles the linguistic speech. We have also already seen through the metaphor of the homosexual act the importance of the recourse to a medical register, also present in the paragraph on courtly metaphors concerning defecation, menstruation, urination. This inclusion of medical metaphors is certainly due to the rhetorician's will to include all sciences in his rhetorical discourse. Rhetoric is a super science which contains life and death and includes all the other sciences in itself. It must therefore include a reflection on medicine, and the rhetorician must have a medical knowledge in the famous chapter 8 of the Retorica Novissima on memory, so very well known to Enrico Artifoni here present, studied by Mary Carruthers, the chambers of the brain of the human microcosm are moreover presented according to a medical terminology. The Boncompagno presents also an original description of mourning and burial practices and of funeral practices, which leads to a succinct comparative presentation of the different techniques, past and present, of preservation or preparation of the bodies of the deceased, from ancient Rome to 13th century Germany. The place of the body in Boncompagno's discursive strategy also appears in the Liber de Malo Senectutis et Senii, with its graphic depiction of the illnesses of old age, and in the Liber de Amicizia, a rhetorical exercise in the presentation of social bonds and their label character, taking as a pretext the description of the different forms of friendship and their fragility. It is indeed in the prologue the human body itself which presents itself in front of the human reason to complain about this unfaithful character of friendship. Beyond this rhetorical device, the treatise presents, among other elements, a chapter which reveals once again the impossibility to draw a limit between political and non-political body metaphor. In the 37 categories of friends invented by Boncompagno, we count the blinded friend, or amicus orbatus, who rushes towards his ruin mainly because of his amicizia, too trusting in women, instruments of the demon, which takes away the use of his eyes. The metaphor of blindness has a maximum value, not only because it is linked to the representation of fortuna cieca, blind fortune, as well as to numerous biblical passages, especially the Gospels, but also because Boncompagno recalls several times in this book, and in other ones, the fate of the Byzantine emperor of the dynasty of the Angels, Isaac II, who was blinded by his own brother, Alexis. To the metaphorical blinding of this chapter, such as Adam, David, Solomon, Samson, is added in the list the Emperor Alexis, also metaphorically blinded, who blinds his own brother. Boncompagno uses the metaphor to suggest that the number of blinded men and women is infinite, making the whole society an assembly of blind people, according to the metaphor that would be put into painting a few centuries later by Grévin. The selected examples thus associate the father of humanity, archetypal prophet kings, the sovereign contemporary of Boncompagno himself, Isaac, and the whole of society, or almost. There is no clear separation between the metaphor of blindness and its reality, nor between the blindness of the sovereigns and that of the political or the social body. And we are entering the third part. Let's start again from the staging of the disaster of the Byzantine Empire between 1196 and 1204 through the conflicts of the imperial family to try to understand how, from these two metaphorical and corporeal cultures, Boncompagno organizes in some place of his multifaceted work a corporalized representation of political events. In the Boncompagno constructs an imaginary discourse in the feminine, putting in the mouth of Irene Angelina, daughter of Emperor Isaac, queen of the Romans, wife of Philip of Swabia, uncle of Henry II, a decoratio on the fate of her first and new family. Her father Isaac was blinded and killed by his brother. Her first husband, Roger of Lecce, was also blinded by Henry VI, and Boncompagno confuses here Roger and his brother Guglielmo. Her second husband, Philip, was murdered in 1208, and his brother Isaac IV also ended blinded. These pathetic details are of less interest to us than the rhetoric constructed by Boncompagno to make the queen of the Romans speak. The blinding and successive murder of her father, her brother, her two husbands caused two collapses. The Byzantine Empire explodes, and the queen's body is promised to an eternal languor. One could almost schematize by suggesting that the blindness of the imperial body generates the destruction of the political body and the weakening of the female body of the princess. This typification of misfortune introduces us to the series of representations of the suffering body politic that it is possible to serialize, mainly but not only from the examples contained in the Boncompagnos, with its rich collection of fictive letters. In a series of letters dealing with bishop elects, a model concerning a letter of congratulation for the election of a Bolognese master to the episcopal see of Novara or Lucca, depending on the manuscripts, Boncompagno uses the corporeal metaphor of the church of Novara, lady that was in darkness, or was corporally blackened, denigrata, because deprived of a pastor. However, the term used to qualify this deprivation, orbatus, is the same one that is used in the Liber de Amicizia to describe the series of metaphorically blinded rulers. In other words, in a relatively banal rhetorical construction, evoking the deprivation of one's pastor by a church that is blackened by it receives perhaps an additional semantic and metaphorical veiled value if one records that orbatus also suggests the momentary or definitive loss of sight. If one interprets the fact that the Church of Novara, deprived of its pastor, was blackened in the sense that it saw only darkness, having lost its sight, one can better explain the description of its wandering in a kind of labyrinth where this church would have been lost if the Lord had not enlightened her with the election of a new bishop. The comparison of this is an innuendo. The comparison of this apparently simple rhetorical construction with a series of amici orbati given by Boncompagno in his Rhetorica gives this classical description of a grieving widow church a corporeal metaphorical dimension or flavor that it hardly has at first reading. Before turning to other examples of feminine lamentation of a masculine absence, let us now consider another metaphor, including a feminine presence, but this time a maternal one, applied to the body politic that can be object to a similar serialization. In the Rhetorica Novissima, Boncompagno engages in a formal critique of canon law, which is presented in various places as abusive and imperfect. In a sub-chapter reserved for the rhetorical figure of a pro et contra, he uses the quite uncommon metaphor of a half-born body. Canon law barely emits faint winds because it is for the most part still stuck in its mother's womb. It is not yet clear how the unborn limbs will match the head, since the parts already produced are constantly changing. This biting satire of the incoherence of canon law, which lacks the beautiful ordinance of civil law with the edifice of the Justinian corpus, thus uses the corporeal metaphor of the half-born being whose head emerges while the other limbs are still partly in the darkness of the maternal womb, the mother being by assume the church. No, it can be related to another uterine metaphor of Boncompagno. In a letter to the Palatine counts of the greedy family of Tuscany, urging them to put an end to their internal struggles, Boncompagno takes the example of the uterine struggles of Jacob and Esau. The latter, symbolizing the evil, prevented with his father's breath the legitimate heir to come out first of the maternal belly. The civil war within a great feudal family of Tuscany, still very powerful at the time of Boncompagno's youth, is thus symbolized by the savage struggle of two twins in their mother's womb. The scheme is the same one that is used to imply the disharmony of the different parts of the canon law coming out successively from the womb of the church. It is not surprising that the metaphor of the body politic is constructed in the context of the 12th-13th century from the mother or father figure. The most expected combinations for the union of society and its leader are indeed the metaphor of the parental body protecting the filial body, or that of the perfect couple represented by the bodies of the beloved and the loved one, depending on whether the reunion of the political and mystical bodies is envisaged in a vertical or horizontal way. Another model letter of Boncompagno on the election of an Archbishop of Mainz presents a classic example of the rejoicing of the members of the ecclesiastical body having found with their father their head. Nevertheless, I would like to emphasize through two last examples, leading to the conclusion that Boncompagno's work, whose strong sexualization we have seen, suggests to what extent the body metaphor of the body politic could have not only had a gender dimension, but a potentially sexual one in the 13th century. In a model letter exalting the pro-imperial character of Pisa, the great maritime city called upon Frederick II, still young, perhaps 1220, 25, to come and punish the rebels who have sworn since the death of Henry VI. The epistle is rich in corporal metaphor. The city of Pisa appears implicitly under the features of a widowed wife weeping, waiting for the imperial husband. The center of the letter contains a hardly cryptic attack against the encroachments of the ecclesiastical power. The injustice, says Pisa, originated in the major sanctuary because the spiritual sword wanted to slip into the same scala, in the same vagina, as the temporal sword, so that once the head was sick, the various members of the body politic became corrupted. The metaphor applies here primarily to the members of the body politic who sink into chaos once the governing body loses its integrity. Here because two competing powers want to occupy the same physical space. It is, however, difficult not to underline the coincidence of the metaphor of the scala, vagina, that can only contain one third, with Boncompagno's reflections on the use of the term vagina to designate the female sex. Without postulating a conscious use of this motif in a sexual perspective, the serialization of the reflections on the metaphorical value of the vagina in Boncompagno's rhetorical work suggests nevertheless to sexualize more heavily than we are used to do banal metaphors of power, such as the two swords. Just as the figure of the ecclesia or the civitas orbata, the church or the city deprived of something or someone, can be corporalized if we superimpose the use of orbatus to qualify the blind person deprived of the sight. The metaphor of the gladius, of the sword lodged in the wrong sheath, takes a more corporeal meaning if we bring it closer to Boncompagno's reflections on the membrum pudicundum, the vagina. A final passage from the Boncompagnos will underline how little risk this kind of speculation actually takes, at least on a rhetorical level. A fictitious exchange between a queen of Hungary and an emperor is the pretext for saucy jokes about their sexual activity. Saucy to Boncompagno of his contemporary. The queen boasts that her field is regularly plowed by the king. The emperor replies that the imperial scepter, rod or virga, has only half risen and less than usual because it had been agitated more than usual in other orchards than the queen's. Beyond the facetiousness, revindicated as such, Boncompagno speaks in the title of the last lecture of the Iocunda transfunctio, the comic metaphor that it contains, the assimilation between the rural sector of verge and the male sex, here explicitly proclaimed, metaphorizes the rural function by biologizing it. The queen is transformed into an orchard, it's time to be impregnated by the sovereign or by a neighboring sovereign. Concluding hypothesis. By invoking this rather banal image in conclusion, I do not claim to have shown that the reading of Boncompagno's treatises revolutionized our knowledge of corporeal metaphors and their application to the political field. There is much to ponder on the fact that this master employs a network of metaphors that are very monarchical, and in some respects archaizing in a communal Italy renowned for the modernity of its political constructions. This will not surprise researchers studying the stage of construction of the representation in majesty of the Italian political communes, a sector perhaps more worked these last years at the level of the history of the art, with the quarrels on the fresco, the eternal quarrels, on the fresco of the good government of Siena, than at that of the political speeches, properly speaking, if I accept the numerous work of Enrico here present. What I have tried to show is how the superimposition of different levels of rhetorical argumentation in Boncompagno's work allows us to refine our view of the construction of these metaphors of the body politics, symbolized by a woman in waiting, a loving father, a labor, a being still in the womb or half in the womb, that we encounter in his fictional letters as well as in the political letters and speeches actually exchanged during 13th century Italy. Thanks to the theoretical or semi-theoretical explanation of the Rhetorica Novissima, or simply to the satirization of different passages, we can give back their corporeal dimension to some of these metaphors, like the one of the Orbata city, medicalize them, sometimes radicalize them. We can be wrong also. We can also undoubtedly make use of this catalogue of memorizations of the sexual act or the sexual organ by the society of the 13th century to specify our reflections on the definition of the political body. What is the political body? Since these are elements of society that must be controlled by the church, it is probably licit to extend to the political metaphor to the domain of metaphors concerning the female or male body, considered as a sinful instrument. Finally, I wanted in this presentation to follow as visibly as possible in the footsteps of your program and to speak first and foremost of the human body, in order to adjust my thinking to yours. I am, however, for my part, intimately persuaded that there is no fixed limit between the metaphor of the political or politicized body, starting from the representation of the social body as a human body, and other types of metaphors, speaking about the body of the sovereign, of the leaders, of the actors of the society by resorting, for example, to innumerous processes of animalization, like the animalizations of the body of the sovereign in lion, in dragon, or that of the preacher in ox, in dog, and so on. Insofar as the body of certain imagined entities, the king, the ecclesia, the regnum, the civitas, merges in part with the imaginary political body of the medieval world, it is the whole of their metaphorizations which potentially enters into our subject of study. And Boncompagno was thus right, it is the whole universe, in the end, that is metaphor. Thank you very much. E grazie per aver sopportato l'italiano. Grazie.
Grazie a te, Benoît. As Benoît said, we can have this discussion in Italian, in French, in English. So if you need time to gather your thoughts, I can get started. But if there is anyone who's ready, make yourself known. Okay, I will go first then. Sorry, vai Rudy.
Intanto grazie per il corpo molto interessante, molto erudito, completo. Io mi chiedevo, visto che hai menzionato che Boncompagno aveva questo carattere faceto, scherzoso, giocondo, hai visto che comunque il mio dottorato è concentrato sull'uso dell'ironia del buddismo cinese, Mi chiedevo se secondo te l'ironia non sia una di quelle strategie, sia retoriche che proprio esistenziali, che portano poi a enfatizzare proprio il gioco delle metafore.
Sì, penso che funzioni molto bene, perché lui è un esempio estremo, nel senso che è un uomo estremamente faccettoso, ha realmente queste barzellette stupide di dire a una città intera speculare davanti a voi domenica venite e vengono le quali gli dice in faccia siete cretini, cioè è tutto un uomo terribile del resto, finito in povertà, si sa perché. Ma è una costante che possiamo trovare malgrado in diversi trattati nella pedagogia della retorica dell'epoca e non soltanto della retorica, però particolarmente nella retorica c'è questo gioco anche per fare passare tutto questo sapere agli studenti. Non è necessariamente una strategia di dissimulazione, però è una strategia molto cosciente e questo aiuta naturalmente a scatenare il gioco della metafora. Il mio problema come specialista della retorica, che posso dire di esserlo per una grande parte, come Enrico qui presente, non facciamo soltanto questo, però facciamo questo, e che spesso si entra in queste categorie letterario o non letterario. Ora c'è la categoria retorica che nel Medioevo alla fine è più interessante forse per molti documenti della categoria letteraria, se vogliamo pensare a questi testi. Sono in un mondo di modernizzazione della società per gente che dovrà fare discorsi politici e è una cosa da trattare con un modo molto speciale a livello del significato di questi testi, e il problema dell'ironia o della barzelletta diretta è un po' da interpretare in questa chiave. Cosa vuol dire scrivere una falsa lettera sulla cattedrale di Costantinopoli, per esempio, come fa, o sui inventi così, e dire cose che gli altri non dicono perché la lettera che fanno è vera, è destinata al papato o a un re e non può giocare su queste cose. Dunque c'è un entre deux, se posso dirlo in francese, da particolare in questo gioco, una certa divisione che aiuta alla metaforizzazione. Questo sono persuaso.
Grazie.
Thank you very much for your fascinating talk. So, continuing question raised by Rudy. The author speaks about the relations between metonymy, analogy, and metaphor. So, because they're all linked somehow by this notion of similitudo, which I saw on the screen. So, are there any connections through this similitudo, and does he explain the differences between the three notions? So, another question is, are the metaphors you presented more frequent in the opera of the author, or it was your choice to just to speak about these metaphors? Do these metaphors form a kind of field? So are the usages connected among them, or these are just dispersed usages in particular contexts? Yeah, I think that's it, yeah. Actually, yeah, the last question about the polysemy of the same metaphors. Have you found any occurrences of different usages, for instance, of oculos? So in one context is a metaphor for one thing, in another context, so polysemy in a modern sense and not in the medieval one.
Okay. No, it's a lot, but I can try and answer rapidly, even if I am not similitudo. It's an interesting thing because he is a good rhetorician, and there is a clear definition of a set of separate figures for this displacement of sense, which he knows very well. But there is a tension. There are not only him, but also masters like Enrico da Signa, Benoît Grévin to some point, very interesting in saying we are not interested in just transfunctio mechanics. We want to use transfunctio to cover all this big thing of a spacing of sense. Still, in the Locaveneris, for example, he makes a discussion saying, here I am more on the field of similitudo, you have to pay attention, but still we englobe it in transfunctio. So it's a very conscious operation of broadening the sense of the metaphor, It's not. It seems that we lose something at the theoretical level, but it's a tool that requires its might, its force to do what they want to do. We are the rhetoricians and we govern the year because they take this broader concept. They do not lose the consciousness of the possibility of dividing between 8 or 7 sub-figures very precisely, finely crafted. For the frequency of these metaphors, I'd say that at a very crude level, this homosexual metaphor, for example, it's very rare in this context. It's not very rare if you displace the field and you enter Tuscan poetry of the 1280s, 90s, even a little before that, the semi-political, satirical poetry of the youth of Dante or the generation before. And it's interesting that Ars Poetriae, be it Latin or Vulgar, will not be so separate from this domain. My guess is that the big complexes of the widow who waits for the husband, things like that, this is a big field. You can adjust a part of the structures of sexualized metaphors to a lot of repeating, claiming, and figurative meanings of what is the body politic in medieval Italy of the 13th century, when you are always awaiting a bishop, a new pope, a new emperor, a new marquis in certain region. So it's not something that is not that wouldn't be infrequent. Boncompagno is an extraordinary. It's not elegant to say it, supermarket of rhetoric. So these sexual metaphors are a tiny part of the whole bargain. It speaks of everything possible, and it's a very vast work, vast ensemble of works. So I emphasize it because it was the project of the body, so it was very useful. The first start of panic passed when I said to myself what I am to do with this program in connection to my to this field, because I didn't want to do just a lesson on the metaphor in Boncompagno. It was a little too it was not risky enough. The polysemy, I think that I have covered the second and the third question with that. The polysemy, I think it's quite natural to, it's perfectly normal. You have to get it best and they know them very well, to get to Ars Predicandi, to feel it very well in 1200,000. Alanus of Lille, Alain de Lille, one of the great teacher and preacher of late 12th century France, makes this distinctiones theologicae, which is just an extraordinarily well done repertoire of what is the metaphorical significance of 100 terms for a man who wants to preach, and who will have things like oculus, arca, diabolus, aquila, and there will be 20, 30 meanings, and a lot of opposite meanings. In the Rhetoricanonissima, you have subcategories on metaphors that can have totally opposite meanings, and he does that very well too, but it's not, that is normal. That is normal in the biblical culture, because Aquila or Leo in the Bible is fundamentally polysemic, with a possibility of Satan from one part and God from another, automatic, and they have to know that. It's we have to think biblical if we want to understand this uniqueness. If we remain at the superfice of the Bible, there's a problem for a medievist who wants to know a little what they thought and what they wrote in this universe. So it's more or less what I answer to that in my bad English.
Well, first, just thank you, I think, for all of the team.
I could do it in Italian.
Very well done, and I'll follow in there.
Okay.
Sorry, too quiet. Okay.
Yeah.
So first, thank you, because I think we're all going to find this extremely useful for our thinking about metaphors and the project. I just wanted to go back to something you mentioned, I think, both in your answer to Daniel and before, this idea that Boncompagno is broadening the sense of a metaphor, using it in a very, very wide sense. Here I kind of saw a bit of a similarity to Aristotle's idea of the metaphor. Of course, this is really before the reception of Aristotle, but it is the Ciceronian criticism of what how Aristotle discusses metaphors. So here I wanted to ask you a little bit about his relationship to his sources, Quintilian, what knowledge of Aristotle in various kind of collections there might have been, and also Cicero here, and how is he positioning himself there? And then slightly related to that, is he explicitly engaging in the relationship of rhetoric to epistemology, logic, and the discussion of similitude? Does metaphor here have that kind of lofty ambition of a theories of knowledge?
Okay, for the second one, it is perhaps a little more difficult, but I can answer still, I think. For the first one, the Quintilian point is a little perhaps overplayed in the literature, just because it's normal. We know that the first good description, transsumptio, come from this work. I don't think that it is very real at this time of Middle Ages. It's secondary. It's to retrace the origin of the thing, and then it passes in different fields. You can find something in Augustinus. So Aristotle, I think, no, the basis can be very Aristotelian, because for logic and grammar and transferring of meanings, they rely a lot on Boetius. And Boetius is just, for this part, a Latinization of Aristotle, so it's plain the basis of a lot of the good thought on what is exactly the problem of analyzing this sort of secondary meanings is a sort of Aristotle. There are so many medieval Aristotle. They don't have to wait for the new translations, the coming ones of his time, or even if there is that dimension too, of the literature, they can certainly do a good and the Analytica of Boetius. They read that a lot in this period, in these circles. For the problem of logic, that's a little more tricky, because definitely Boncompagno wants, as will want a lot of grammarians with rhetorical ambitions, or rhetoricians with other ambitions, practitioners to my Pepus Devine, which I know quite well, to merge dialectic and logic with rhetoric, to subsume these matters into rhetoric. But you have a logical knowledge and a grammatical knowledge, not grammatica practica, but grammatica or the high grammar of the schools of the time, which is extraordinarily developed in 1200, and you don't improvise yourself a good logician or a good dialectician if you have not really this mentality. And so my guess for Boncompagno is that this part precisely of the wisdom affects it more or less. He includes it, but it's not very impressive. He will make something at the dialectical level or logical to say, see, there is this sort of thing. I have it in me, just like medicine, just like law, but it's not so interesting. He's more interesting when he's speaking of law. He teaches at Bologna. It's no miracle. And also when he teaches of medicine, he was keen on medicine, clearly, and he knew some very interesting things. You can find very precise echo of the Scola Salernitana or things like that. On dialectic or logic, he's quite basic. So programmatically in medicine, there is that too in the supermarket, but it's not very good stuff in these shelves of the supermarket.
Io ho un paio di domande, ma non necessariamente le ultime.
forse di livello più generale, cioè per un maestro di retorica come Boncompagno, a cosa serve la metafora o la transuzio piuttosto? Nel senso che hai detto due cose. La prima è che Boncompagno dice che la metafora rivela i segreti del mondo, no? Quindi ha una funzione, diciamo, di interpretazione, di disvelamento, ma va usata con moderazione, il che già ci porta su un altro livello. E la seconda è che il buon retore, o comunque il buon oratore, deve utilizzare tutti gli strumenti a sua disposizione per persuadere, che diciamo è una cosa decisamente comprensibile. E dunque la metafora ha una funzione cognitiva, esplicativa, o ha soprattutto una funzione emotiva e persuasiva? Cioè c'è una riflessione esplicita su questo, perché i testi non li conosco personalmente, ma magari è proprio il mestiere del maestro di retorica dirci a cosa serve la transuzio.
È un vasto soggetto, perché è un po' il cuore del soggetto ci fa arrivare. Quando dice va usata con moderazione, sembra quasi una barzelletta odiosa, perché ci ha versato tutte queste metafore, ma va usata con figurante. Ciò detto, c'è una linea di spiegazione mai in italiano, deve essere un francesismo. Insomma, c'è un fossato.
Ma capiamo.
Ok, cioè c'è un fossato, o almeno c'è una crepa molto interessante, perché come vi ricorderete forse il dibattito di qualche maniera era già in corso verso il 1200, fino a che punto metaforizziamo la comunicazione politica, e finirà per diventare un po' acuto verso il 1240-1260, quando certi grandi giuristi del nord diranno basta con lo stile alla fiera della vigna, che è troppo metaforizzato, pensando piuttosto a delle applicazioni metaforizzate nel livello del diritto proprio, che è naturalmente un grande pericolo, perché se si metaforizza il livello del diritto possono essere proprio guai. Però è un po' strano anche perché quando si parla di fiera della vigna, insomma le metaforizzazioni più spettacolari sono piuttosto nei testi. Loro penso che sono molto coscienti, serve a diversi livelli. Lo dobbiamo analizzare questo senza separare artificialmente la retorica dell'ars litteris, diciamo, i grandi atti solenni, gli atti meno solenni ma importanti, e la comunicazione epistolare di tutti con tutti, di altre correnti di comunicazioni, e gli specialisti della retorica sono sempre qui con la poesia, è importantissimo, però l'ars predicanti e i sermoni è almeno così importante, se non di più, perché alla fine l'impatto sulla società è molto più grande. E se si pensa a come sono costruiti questi queste prediche, è importante capire che loro sono veramente persuasi che questo sapere gli dà una presa. Per questo ho insistito un po' nell'introduzione su questo punto, da maestri di retorica quasi equivalente a quelli dei professori dell'ortodossia cattolica della Sorbonne, che non esiste ancora, insomma, le scuole parigine, e della curia papale, che è al centro di questo sistema di comunicazione comunque, che l'ha lanciato prima e che lo mantiene come modello, e questo è una cosa che è spesso dimenticata un po' nel mondo comunale, che se il rettore domina questa scienza della metafora, di qualche maniera arriva a un livello che di qualche maniera è un po' equivalente a quello dei teologi, perché ha i segreti biblici della natura, l'idea che a livello della natura ci si arriva, ci sono barriere, non dicono siamo i maestri della teologia, se no fanno esplodere il sistema o hanno così problemi, ed è normale, però a livello della natura, della riflessione della macchina mondi, ci possono arrivare, e lo dicono esplicitamente, però questo gli serve, penso, come strumento sociale per affermarsi, uno strumento usato da questa classe come sarà usato lo stile ciceroniano nel tardo Trecento per tutta un'altra cosa, ma serve anche per creare proprio questi testi politici in maniera efficace secondo la loro dottrina. Poi occorre vedere effettivamente cosa fanno per applicarlo in un contesto comunale, può essere molto differente della curia papale o della corte siciliana imperiale. Poi il problema della riflessione cognitiva, persuasione, aspetto cognitivo, aspetto di persuasione è molto chiaramente e spudoratamente detto in Boncompagno, ma si ritroverebbe anche in altri autori molto meno conosciuti, Enrico da Isernia, forse un po' nelle opere teoriche di Tommaso di Gaffa, che è una grossissima figura del lato papale, insomma si può ricostruire tutta una cosa. Ma quello è meno sorprendente perché è una rielaborazione medievale di una cosa che si trova già nella retorica classica, cioè che la cognizione perfetta partendo da un oratore o da un epistolografo, che è un ottimo lettore che conosce questi segreti cognitivi di qualche maniera, che ha questa scienza globale che gli permette, gli consente di essere un buon lettore, fa sì che lui può dominare coscientemente questi strumenti per descrivere il mondo, ma a livello emozionale può manovrare le masse politiche che loro non lo conoscono bene e lo dicono proprio nei testi, perché è così che funziona la retorica, è fatta effettivamente per giocare a partire di trucchi metaforici sul pubblico e influenzare il pubblico. E là che penso che ci sia una cosa molto ambigua tra l'ideologia della Chiesa e dell'istituzione ecclesiastica con la dominazione della teologia e il latino da un lato e i famosi laici rudes et ignorantes, i laici duri, non educati e ignoranti che non sanno il latino o di latino poco sanno, perché questa cosa è fatta da questa classe molto particolare che sono i notari, che sono un po' tra i due mondi, che creano questa retorica che poi sarà spiegata in volgare, o che sarà capita fino a un certo livello in latino, ci sarà sempre qualcuno per dire non capite a fondo. Là il problema è un po' la differenza tra certi testi teorici e poi la retorica veramente creata, nel senso che i notai tra di loro e i lettori tra di loro si possono scatenare queste metafore sull'omosessualità, oggettivamente facevano ridere, capivano bene di cosa si trattava, ma non sono facili, erano già complesse nel tempo, e quella per capirle partendo da un livello di cultura basso non ne potevano essere tradotte in italiano verso 1925, nessuno ci avrebbe capito tante cose, almeno sulla cosa di un vir, un bit in femmina e cose così. Poi quando si tratta di fare una vera lettera politica è calibrata in maniera un po' differente, però penso che l'argomento della chiarezza comunicativa, cioè le cose devono essere chiare, ci sono altre barriere che noi vediamo poco, e dare un'idea che tutto dovesse essere perfettamente chiaro in una comunicazione politica non è un'idea del 200. È un'idea, quello è un anacronismo se lo pensiamo così, è un'idea che è più valida per la predica, perché la predica, se orientata in una certa direzione, deve diventare paratassica, deve spiegare il simbolo, perché vuol fare passare qualcosa a tutta una rete di gente che non ha capacità per farlo passare. Le lettere politiche vanno da interprete dotto a interprete dotto per essere disposte nelle corti. E poi c'è questo mondo intermedio, però il livello di cultura della gente che studia a Bologna è un livello alto, dunque sono capaci di orientare questo gioco con le metafore in funzione dei loro oggettivi. Poi il livello del loro insegnamento è molto alto, non vuol dire che nella pratica gli si chiedono le stesse cose e che non sapranno adattare per fare una retorica civile, comunale, che sarà abbastanza differente, forse più semplice e che converrà meglio ai bisogni dei comuni del nord. Questo è ancora un altro mondo, però sono molto coscienti di come usare questa cosa come attrezzo, e sono così al loro modo vanitosi e pretenziosi degli umanisti dell'inizio del 400. Noi sappiamo, gli altri non sanno. È un altro mondo, però c'è molto di questo.
Enzo.
Sì, è affascinante questa idea della metafora come macchinetta, come vera e propria macchina che serve a creare una specie di grande arsenale attorno al corpo. Senza la metafora il linguaggio del corpo non avrebbe quella potenza di comunicazione, quella capacità di descrivere tutto quanto. Con Serena abbiamo sempre discusso, quando è nato questo progetto, a me ha sempre interessato come studioso di storia moderna, il problema del depotenziamento del linguaggio del corpo, la sua trasformazione nel tempo. Il problema della metafora in età medievale è cruciale. È cruciale, come ha detto Serena, da un punto di vista perché funziona nella retorica come strumento conoscitivo, quindi legittima il discorso retorico attraverso la conoscenza. Io ho discusso queste cose una volta con Paolo Grossi, che è morto, è stato un grande studioso del diritto medievale, e la sua tesi era che il diritto era la scienza delle scienze, assieme alla teologia erano le due grandi forme di conoscenza della realtà. E quindi da questo punto di vista effettivamente il tema cruciale della metafora nell'ambito di questo discorso del depotenziamento del linguaggio del corpo, con l'apparizione della rivoluzione scientifica i passaggi non sono più quelli attraverso la metafora, cioè la metafora perde il suo potere, non ha più un potere conoscitivo e trasla nel campo letterario, ma non ha più quella forza di poter dominare e far crescere il linguaggio del corpo. Allora, la prima, due questioni. Una, a un certo punto il linguaggio del corpo perde di significato quando a un certo punto il corpo diventa essenzialmente il corpo dell'individuo, la fisiologia dell'individuo, la scienza dell'individuo, e rimane la metafora corporale solo per illustrare le identità collettive, non tanto l'individuo, perché l'individuo riprende la sua identità fisiologica come strumento, come corpo da conoscere, fisiologicamente da conoscere. Poi arriviamo ai diritti dell'individuo e così via. Però quello che è molto interessante è ad esempio il fatto che un grande studioso come Ernest Cassirer, nella filosofia simbolica del simbolo, il simbolo va ad acquistare un qualche ruolo che aveva la metafora nella fase medievale. Allora la domanda è questa: tra simbolo e metafora che cosa sta succedendo? Che cosa succede dal punto di vista conoscitivo? Perché questo per noi è molto importante per capire nel campo, è chiaro che c'è tutta la sfera della conoscenza scientifica che entra in gioco, ma nel campo politico il problema del corpo perde quella capacità di persuasione retorica che aveva nella fase medievale. Cruciale certamente la rivoluzione scientifica, ma il discorso del simbolo rispetto alla metafora è un qualcosa che mi piacerebbe cercare di capire meglio. Hai provato a pensarci sopra qualche volta?
Una simile interrogazione è già stata fatta diversi anni a Parigi. Devo dire che partendo da queste ricerche non è essenzialmente non è facile per me pensarci in questi termini, anche se non disaccordo per niente, sono abbastanza, seguo benissimo la sua interpretazione, che mi sembra perfettamente coerente. Aggiungerei forse a un livello di retorica che già il modo, allora che non eravamo ancora in un mondo scientifico, il modo di presentare le cose della retorica neoclassica del umanesimo maturo, con il suo amore per la similitude e non più la metafora, e là la barriera si diventa veramente dura, presenta le cose in maniera abbastanza differente, dunque forma una specie di soglia che già spingeva un po' in questa direzione. La cosa che mi verrebbe se dovessi improvvisare qualcosa su questo implico simbolo-metafora, sarebbe esplorando proprio i momenti numerosissimi dove si incentrano anche in permanenza nei trattati retorici, e di questo ho parlato pochissimo, allora che è abbastanza ricco, sui simboli del cristianesimo legati proprio all'incarnazione. Perché là c'è un nodo molto duro che è particolarmente interessante perché è molto resistente. Quelli gli umanisti non lo possono infrangere, almeno forse i cerchi neopagani degli anni 450 sono finiti mare, però insomma, e dunque questo è una cosa che possiamo prendere perché possiamo vedere fino a che punto le strutture retoriche del 200 resistono in questa angolazione fino a una certa arte predicatoria o certe cose del 600-700 e come sono proprio attaccate all'ascido dalla scienza quando diventa veramente imponente per me, forse a livello retorico nel 700 proprio, perché effettivamente le cose cambiano enormemente, anche se ci possono essere tanti livelli per ripetere a questo, perché al momento dove arrivano questi problemi del simbolo dell'incarnazione, del sangue di Cristo, di cos'è esattamente questo fenomeno, là entrano veramente in una massa dove il problema del simbolo diventa ugualmente un problema della metafora, ma non si può più parlare soltanto di metafora, se no c'è un problema. E non è perché è teologico che non lo fanno, perché magari tutto è al centro di questi sistemi di figure. Ogni volta che c'è la sposa vedova che aspetta lo sposo, ricordiamo il Cantico dei Cantici, ed è anche Cristo, insomma, e questo è una figura su 30 figure possibili, forse 100, che sono sviluppate attorno a questa unione di Cristo con la società, e dunque alla fine in questo nucleo possiamo lavorare, penso, già dal mio periodo su questo problema simbolo-metafora, però per il mio conto sarebbe un lavoro tutto da fare. Credo che
o Enrico in fila, volevo dire Enzo che non sono sicura che questo linguaggio del corpo sia così depotenziato poi. Pensavo adesso diamo la parola a Enrico, però pensavo a tutta la retorica della nazione.
Ma nell'entità collettiva l'organicismo è una creazione politica esattamente
sì.
Ma certo, ma è nelle entità collettive soprattutto diventa formidabile, il corpo politico.
Enrico, prego.
A proposito di quest'ultimo discorso sul valore religioso, l'Eucaristia è una forma di transuzio, no, ci sarebbero tante cose da dire perché il testo su cui ha lavorato Benoît, la retorica bellissima, è un testo affascinante. Io lo invidio molto perché certamente dentro questo testo affascinante lui ha preso il libro, ma era giusto che fosse così. Eravamo tutti d'accordo, lui si è occupato del libro più affascinante, cioè quello sulla transuzio. Io continuo a dire transuzio perché la resa di metafora è una resa solo parziale. Infatti credo che si lascerà nell'edizione definitiva la parola transuzio. La transuzio non è, a proposito anche di alcune domande che ho sentito prima, non è una figura retorica precisa, a volte si dice catacrisi, a volte metonimia, e non è una figura retorica precisa perché è un'attitudine di pensiero, vale a dire che è la capacità di vedere i funzionamenti arcani della macchina del mondo, ma non di in qualche modo inventarli retoricamente. Ci sono quei funzionamenti, cioè la retorica, la transuzio è al centro del mondo di Boncompagno perché lui ritiene che sia al centro del mondo effettivo. Tutte le cose sono collegate e tutte le cose possono essere dette, diciamo, metaforicamente. L'ideale sarebbe spiegare, cioè usare la parola transuntivamente. Secondo me la più bella definizione di transuzio che mi è capitato di leggere l'ha data Mengaldo in un pezzo del commento al De Vulgari Eloquentia. Esce dalla stretta di dire che è una figura retorica precisa, dice che l'insieme dei modi metaforico-simbolici protratti. Mi pare che metaforico-simbolici però non esercitati one spot, cioè su un punto preciso, cioè protratti, fatti per costruire un discorso. Benoît ha lasciato in parte da parte una questione fondamentale, e cioè che la derivazione culturale di questa attitudine è una derivazione nettamente platonica, un platonismo assunto sostanzialmente attraverso i grandi poemi cosmologici della scuola di Chartres. Bernardo Silvestre, in primo luogo.
Sì, lo stesso è il di Sá, il grande poeta.
Allora, sì, infatti lo sai molto meglio di me. Il fenomeno culturale interessante, io vedo le cose soprattutto dal punto di vista, diciamo, della costruzione di gruppi intellettuali, e come nella prima metà del 200 dei gruppi di dettatori in Italia e maestri di retorica abbiano potuto macinare, triturare, talvolta anche in forme trash, davvero.
C'era qualche trash.
Boncompagno no, testi che erano testi di altissima cultura e che comunque conoscevano benissimo. La specificità di Boncompagno, ce ne sono tante naturalmente, no? La specificità di Boncompagno è sapere giocare sui diversi livelli. È vero, qualcuno lo definisce truffator maximus, cioè uno straordinario diciamo inventore di scherzi e di bucle, però al contempo per esempio nei prologhi della retorica nuovissima, del libro di amicizia, dimostra o comunque ostenta una cultura altissima. Ma questo è esattamente parte della sua cultura retorica, cioè far stridere i due livelli culturali per ottenerne effetti buoni. Faccio un esempio semplicissimo che mi ha molto divertito. Lui all'inizio del prologo della retorica nuovissima dice che il suo sapere arriva alla fine dalla la silva, la materia primordiale, quella di cui parla Platone, su cui interviene il demiurgo per progressiva differenziazione. Ecco, nel Boncompagno c'è una rete in cui lui narra il caso di uno studente, è il solito caso che faceva lui, uno studente squattrinato che sta a Bologna, deve chiedere soldi, deve battere soldi presso la famiglia, e lui spiega alla famiglia: guardate, io mi sono messo le mani in tasca, ma lì materia primordiale, niente, nessuna idea, ecco, per dire e questo ha determinato in realtà poi anche delle interpretazioni diverse, perché secondo che uno guarda un corno lo definisce un intellettuale di altissimo livello, derivazione platonico-chartrese, uno guarda la parte popolare e lo definisce, come anche è stato fatto, un popolaresco intellettuale. In realtà è entrambe le cose, perché entrambe le cose fanno parte del proprio retorico, detto così.
Sì, ve lo concordo totalmente, ho messo un po' nello slide e ho rifatto questa nuova edizione commentata della retorica nuovissima, dove tentiamo di mostrare la ricchezza intellettuale delle fonti, tutto, e non avevo capito tutto perché è molto ricco e un autore da non sottovalutare, per il problema della transunzione come una cosa che è metafora senza esserlo. Sono abbastanza d'accordo, mi interessa molto questa attenzione, infatti. Cioè, ho provato a trovare un esempio e una di queste parole apprezzi alla moda, ma che rimane alla moda per un secolo e mezzo, 2 secoli. C'è questa parola inglese che ha fatto un po' una semi-invasione in diversi campi storici questi ultimi anni, che da studiare personalmente, che è the agency of women, the agency of I don't know what, e a me dava studiare perché non la capisco bene, però alla fine non è un po' così, la transizione è una specie di fumo così per progettare una specie di effetto e funziona molto bene. Se ci pensate vuol dire qualcosa, però che vago, pur essendo un po' tutto, per mostrare a che punto Enrico ha ragione quando parla di questo fenomeno di poter ritrovare gli equilibri nella società, di questi giochi compagneschi. Pensate che la transunzio di Dio in uomo, che sembra un po' non forse una cavolata, per una cosa di retore scatenato, si ritrova proprio nel proemio delle Costituzioni di Federico II, che più o meno arrivano 2 anni prima se ricordo bene, sì, sono finite nel 1939, 32 o 33, e proprio nel solenissimo proemio delle Costituzione Fidei secondi, non so se è fatto già da Pietro della Vigna o qualcun altro, perché Pietro della Vigna non è ancora ricchissimo in questo momento, c'è proprio l'uomo hominem transumtum alimo, si riprende esattamente alla stessa maniera, non è proprio una cosa su cui c'era tutta una specie di classe letterata che era più o meno d'accordo per usare questo linguaggio, che era un po' un linguaggio alla moda. Le mode passano per certe mode, non tutte, meno rapidamente che nel nostro mondo, può durare per 3-4 generazioni. È un mondo che effettivamente la transmissione è ancora molto forte all'epoca di Dante, e poi verso 1400 non sappiamo più cosa farsi in Italia, in Svezia sì, ma in italiano sarà un po' passata o rinnovata, però sì, sono molto d'accordo con quello che tu dici, che ci hai lavorato tanto. Ma tu hai fatto il dottorato sulla memoria, no?
Ho fatto?
L'ottavo capitolo nella nuova edizione sulla memoria.
La memoria?
Sì,
ho fatto quelli sull'oratoria civile, la memoria.
E un'opera incredibile, la retorica nuovissima, la faccio un po' di prevendita per i gruppi della sessione, che penso sarà pubblicato più o meno fra un anno, vediamo. Sì. Ma c'è questo capitolo prima di quello sulle transfunziones, che è quello sulla memoria, che forse è un po' più conosciuto in parte anche a causa di Marie Caracteras, che ha fatto delle pagine importanti su lui, anche se ha fatto qualche errore pesante nelle pagine del latino. È un capitolo favoloso anche il capitolo sulla memoria, raccontata da cos'è la memoria per la retorica, ma la memoria in genere. Siccome questo uomo universale parla di tutte le possibilità di memoria, dall'amnesia più totale e dal microcosmo più microscopico.
Conoscere il funzionamento della macchina del mondo.
Sì. E anche una cosa di cristiana, insomma, andate a... Speriamo di fare
Questa è una prevendita molto in anticipo che ci sta
facendo. Sì, speriamo che lo prendiamo un pezzo decente.
Okay. Any other question or altre domande?
Sorry for switching to Italian. Sorry, no. I was just saying that it's pity to switch to Italian halfway, so maybe some people in the audience.
Yes, indeed. So I can provide summaries afterwards to all those who would like to know.
We began with a lot of questions in English,
yes,
too,
right.
But the problem is that in English I speak badly at a normal
level.
Because in Italian I became Boncompagno will that speaks and speaks, but it does me well to speak English.
So one of the things that as a project we were interested in was precisely the distinction, if possible, between microcosm, macrocosm, and transuzio notion of symbolic language and metaphor as a purely linguistic phenomenon, right? Something that exists outside of reality, that describes reality, and we wonder if this distinction can be made or not. And so this paper was very useful, and Boncompagno is a very useful example to think in these terms, because I think there is a vast body of research on these sort of forms of thinking, whereby something symbolizes the entire cosmos because it's part of it. It is connected to it in reality itself. And the use of the metaphor instead as a phenomenon of language rather than something that exists in reality. So, and it seemed to me that in recommending to use the metaphor with moderation, there was a little bit of a switch between the two, because yes, Boncompagno does say that transuzio exists in the world, but on the other hand, he seems conscious of the fact that he can use it arbitrarily, right? He can use it more or less in order to achieve certain, and so in a way it's not just about truth, it's also about play, and it's about, and so this is a very interesting kind of tension.
That is also a play of Boncompagno, a little ironical and not sure to which level, but it's also a mandatory passage, because it's classical in artes dictandi that deal with the concept to say at a certain level, don't overplay it. Typically, there is a very beautiful beautiful little ars dictandi, very, very rarely read from Riccardo da Forti, a scribanius of the papal curia, who is quite famous for a big summa dictaminis of pseudo-papal and papal lectures. We speak of the years 1260, more or less, and he makes an introductory ars dictaminis of pages, but in nucleo everything is there. And he says don't overplay it with metaphors, too big metaphors, things like that. It will be a disaster. You must keep some sort of measure. There is also the idea that the metaphor must be perfectly calibrated, which is classical in rhetoric, but which is interesting. He takes the example of the tempest of the secular world with the ship of or church or the empire. It can be applicated to empire too. And he says to a point, if the tempest is too big, if you speak of mountains, of waves, or things like that, it doesn't do it anymore. It's too much. So and you could serialize this sort of argumentation. It's quite normal. But it's also perhaps a sort of reflection of they are reading the best artist poetry just published, the one of Goffredus of Dinosalvo, which is very beautiful, but perhaps a little too ars poetry, and they are thinking starting from that. It's really an interesting thing, because church controls a big part of the symbolic domination of the language. Boncompagno will end in poverty because he cannot enter the papal chancery, apparently, and Benoît of Florence says explicitly the good he teaches at Bologna, but he says the supreme model and the model we must follow is the lectures of the church, is the lectures of the papacy. So the ultimate control of the metaphor is by the masters of the interpretation of the Bible, not our lectures.
Only a curiosity, the problem of the communication in comparative perspective, classic Chinese, your book. The curiosity is this, the metaphor in the Chinese body language and Latin language is very different. We have the similarity.
There are better specialists in the room than me to answer to this question. And in this paper, Beverly Vosler, who is a great sinologist specialist, among many other things of historiography, but not totally far from it. And me, I've explored different levels, not a little metaphorical, but also rhythm, for example, rhythmized prosa, which is interesting to compare from classical Chinese to medieval Latin, because there is this obsession. We must write in prose, but it must be rhythmized to some degree with discussion and differences, quarrels of how to do that, overdo that or not. My guess is that the level of metaphorization of a political, of an imperial Chinese lecture of the Ming era and a lecture of the age of Dante would not have been so different if we could really arrive to do some sort of statistical study of the thing. Then in detail we will find a lot of things different. It will not be, we can have an impression of over-metaphorization of something on one part and under-metaphorization, which with perhaps a Chinese phraseology that is more metaphorical at the political level when that speaks of the emperor. But I think we must calculate where exactly the weight of the metaphor in the two phraseologies lies, and not say necessarily it is unbalanced, because we don't find automatically the same metaphor or the similar metaphor at the same level of the phrase or of the page or of the document. But really, I have no great culture to do that, because we were both in this article, because Beverly was the specialist of Chinese historiography I read with great difficulty some classical Chinese texts passing through a kind of Japanese adaptation, so I am not the man to answer that. Perhaps Rudy would have better knowledge. I must say that there are things interesting at the level of our research, because for example, historiography was not so enhanced in the Chinese society as in Latin classical and medieval society, medieval and humanistic society. And so the study of the enormous historiographic material of the Chinese culture through the ages, since late antiquity until the Manchu dynasty, has begun, but has begun quite late. And there is very much to do. There are 3, 4, 5 books, but there are not 100 books on what is the later. Meanwhile, from the other side, it's very exciting to see this comparative project on textual history, because serious comparative projects on textual history are not a lot. It's easy to make global history and to say, oh, big empires from that, big empire from this, so great. It's a lot more difficult to make good comparative textual history, because you must have good specialists and you must speak a lot, and it's a lengthy process, because you are bound to make a lot of errors if you go just for some analysis. But, well, difficult to answer that question.
Okay, I think the Palazzo d'Azeglio porters will kick us out very soon, because the building closes at 6. So one round of thanks to Benoît again. The next seminar of these projects open to the public will be on the 22nd of May. We'll confirm the venue, but our speaker is François Julien. And it's going to be, I think, very interesting, a great philosopher and sinologist. So see you all then, if not earlier. Okay.